The moment we've all been nervously waiting for is here, the autumn budget, which has been feared to be one of the scariest budgets in history. Pretty fitting, it's the day before Halloween. With feared tax increases, new ISA rules and pension changes, and with Labour repeatedly failing to define what a working class person was, it wasn't a great sign. Pretty much everything we'd want to avoid. We know the situation we're in for the most part is pretty bleak. We've got ridiculous NHS wait times, underfunded public services, a slow-growing economy, lack of growth, innovation, housing issues, and a cost of living crisis, so something has to be done. But the question is, who's going to pay for it? Well, there was one theme for the budget, that's for sure. Blame, blame, blame. I mean, who do we even believe? The UK autumn budget dropped for 2024, and it's as much about pointing fingers as the numbers. Whether it's blaming the predecessors or touting lofty promises, it's hard to know who to believe anymore. To be honest, the whole thing is pretty embarrassing. You'd think they were a bunch of school kids bickering rather than supposedly the best we've got, who should be working together to do the best for our country, rather than leaving us to try and figure out who's lying. I mean, anyway, I've sat through the whole panto to take out the boring bits and try and make note of everything that I think you need to know. So let's take a look at what's been said and what knock-on effect that has for us as investors, and more importantly, people. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, kicked off by emphasising investment in the NHS, aiming for an NHS that's there when you need it, as she says. One key focus was on maintaining NHS funding levels, particularly in light of increased demand and ongoing staff shortages, which have been a pain point for years. Reeves stressed that healthcare and public services were still a priority, but she was notably quiet on any direct measures that could have immediate impacts, like funding for new specific hospitals or expanding emergency services. We've been told there will be a 10-year plan coming for the NHS, which will be interesting to read, and hopefully a positive for the country. She focused heavily on statements around driving growth. She highlighted a goal of restoring economic stability and growing our economy, while repeatedly chanting invest, 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 which is definitely music to my ears if it works. I'd love to see the economy grow and the UK do well as a nation. I think we're so heavily overshadowed by how well America does, hence why most of our investments end up over there. It would be nice not to have to rely on another country to grow our investments. But what did she actually mean by invest, invest, invest? Essentially, she wants to grow the economy by increasing infrastructure spending and reducing unemployment. She's also made a promise of $22.6 billion in day-to-day spending for the NHS, alongside $3.1 billion in capital spending, which she announced towards the end of the budget. But as always, the devil is in the detail. Let's dig into what's really going on and how this is going to work. There were big numbers and even bigger promises. The Chancellor announced $11.8 billion for victims of the infected blood scandal and $1.8 billion for the post office scandal. These were major scandals that have impacted thousands of people across the UK, and the funds are meant to bring some form of justice and financial support to those affected. She also highlighted her credentials, mentioning that she was a former economist at the Bank of England, clearly trying to instill confidence that she knows her numbers, which I'm sure we'll find out. Inflation, which peaked at 11% in 2023, is now expected to drop significantly. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, is forecasting an average inflation of 2.5% in 2025, falling to 2.1% by 2028. Here, of course, though, we should remember that the current level of inflation she inherited from the awful Tory government she repeatedly points out was already 2.8% when she came into power, which, let's be honest, wasn't particularly due to the Conservatives either, more down to global factors outside of their control. But still, it's a positive to see that those numbers are predicted to go down over the next 4 years. Growth forecasts are similarly optimistic, but cautious. Real GDP growth is expected to be 1.1% for 2024, increasing to 2% in 2025, before eventually settling down to 1.5% by 2029. These projections are promising on paper, but don't account for potential economic shocks that could derail progress, like a significant global downturn or unexpected geopolitical events. To further enhance long-term growth, the government also announced $70 billion in infrastructure investments through the National Wealth Fund. The aim here is to modernise the UK's transportation, digital networks and housing infrastructure to compete better globally. She emphasised that increasing productivity was at the heart of these investments. For reference, the UK currently lags behind the major G7 countries in terms of productivity growth, so a push in this area is crucial. Reeves laid out a growth plan based on 7 key pillars. First was to restore economic stability, trying to stabilise the ship after what's been a rough economic period. 2 was investment in infrastructure, 70 billion through this National Wealth Fund and planning rules aimed at boosting infrastructure. 3 was realising UK potential by working with devolved governments. A devolved government is basically regional administrations like those in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that have certain powers separate from the central government and focusing on local growth plans. 4 was Skills England, which is introducing programmes to increase economic activity and make work more rewarding. 5 was Modern Industrial Strategy, helping small businesses grow, which sounds great, but we'll see if it actually helps. Past government initiatives such as the 2017 Industrial Strategy aimed to boost productivity and support small businesses, but had mixed results. For instance, while some regions saw increased access to funding and support, others struggled with bureaucratic red tape and inconsistent implementation. This new plan will need to address those past problems to be effective. Next was science expansion, record funding to grow the UK's science base. And last but not least was clean energy, investments in carbon capture, storage and green energy, which all sound pretty positive. Fiscal responsibility was another big talking point. Reeves says that borrowing will fall from 4.5% of GDP this year to 2.1% by the end of the forecast period. There's also a target for a budget surplus. Yep, surplus by 2028, which, if true, might be the first real surplus in a long while. To achieve this is a 2% savings target for government departments and a renewed push to tackle COVID-era corruption. Something I actually loved on the issue of corruption was the implementation of a COVID corruption officer, tasked with finding companies who abused COVID profit using taxpayers' money, with the aim of recovering that money, which I think is huge, and it's pretty crazy it wasn't done sooner. She also announced an increase in the national minimum wage to £12.21 per hour and a significant hike for younger workers, with 18 to 21-year-olds seeing a bump to £10 per hour. Carers will also see better support, with a carer's allowance increasing from £81.90 per week, meaning they can work and earn around £10,000 per year, alongside more flexibility for working hours while keeping benefits. This one I think is pretty encouraging, as a lot of people say there's no point in working as I'll lose my allowances. They said they're aiming to reduce the benefits bill and get people back into work. They also want to clamp down on overpayments, increase the household support fund by £1 billion, which aims to help low-income households with the cost of living pressures. This comes at a time when more families than ever are struggling to keep up with the rising energy and food costs, and the fund aims to offer immediate, albeit temporary, relief. She's also lowering the amount of debt repayment that can be taken from 25% to 15%. Some good news that will benefit all of us is that the state pension will be going up by 4.1%, which will equate to £470 per year. For some people that won't be enough, but at least it's something. Now, the thing is, when you see all of these positive changes and they start really building how bad the situation is, you're thinking, here we go. The problem is, it's too much about them looking better than the other party, rather than actual solutions. So you just think, okay, so who's paying for this? So here's the juicy part. Taxes. What's changing? The first one, which I was pretty surprised by, was them freezing the fuel duty. This one seemed like a really obvious one to me for them to go after, but they actually decided to not rise the fuel duty, which means we're spared the extra 7p per litre, at least for now. This is a welcome move, especially by drivers and businesses reliant on transportation, especially considering the already high cost of running vehicles in the UK. I expected this to at least go up a little bit, but we're safe for now. But then the question builds, so if it's not coming from here, then where is it coming from? They've confirmed that as per their manifesto, there would be no rise on income tax, VAT or national insurance for workers. This one, Rishi was pretty quick to jump out of his chair and say they have increased them all, although I do believe some of their other changes will impact workers in these aspects. Income tax is always misleading because they don't hide the thresholds at which we start paying tax. These have been frozen for years, and by now they should have been increased, especially as we've had such high inflation. I expected her to extend this, but she's decided that from 2028 they will be unfrozen. So from then we should see our tax bands increase, which to be honest they should be doing every year. So in a way they aren't increasing them, but they are letting taxes increase on their own. So it's partially good news, but it is 4 more years of freezes. The next one was a really interesting one, which I did expect, which was employers' national insurance. This one's going up by 1.2% to 15% effective from April 2025. They're also reducing the threshold to £5,000, which means businesses start paying national insurance sooner. She has taken some considerations from the Federation of Small Business and increased the employment allowance from £5,000 to £10,000. She said that 865,000 employers won't pay any national insurance next year, and around 1 million will pay the same or less. She emphasised that a company could have 4 workers on the living wage without paying national insurance, which I guess is partially good news if you only pay your workers' living wage. If you pay them more, then it's going to cost you. Now, while this seems like it doesn't affect working people, whatever they class it as, it really does. Huge corporations might just absorb it like it's nothing, but small businesses could struggle. Fewer pay rises and fewer hires. According to the Federation of Small Business, these increases could lead to a significant drop in hiring, especially for firms that are already operating on tight margins. So really, the cost, no matter what, will be put onto working people in one way or another. They'll be the ones not getting the pay rises, the promotions, and people just won't be hiring as much. I just wish they would be more honest about it. Speaking of businesses, there will be business rates relief of 40% for retail, hospitality, and leisure sectors, which is welcome news. There will also be agricultural and business relief. The first £1 million will have no inheritance tax. The aim is to protect small family farms. They say that 3/4 of claims will be unaffected by the changes. I think they'll have to just hope that the farm isn't worth more than £1 million, which I can imagine with very expensive property, land and equipment costs, it could be over that threshold quite quickly. Surely to maintain the industry in the country, it should be free from inheritance tax if they want family businesses to thrive. They're also capping the amount of corporation tax paid at 25%, which is a positive that it's not being increased further, as we need businesses to be profitable. There were some pretty big business investments. Reeves announced major investments, £5 billion into affordable housing, which most people will welcome, £1 billion into aerospace, £2 billion into the automotive sector, $520 million into the life sciences, and a further £2.9 billion into defence. The focus here is not just on expanding production, but also on innovation. For instance, the automotive sector funding is aimed at boosting electric vehicle production, with a goal of making the UK a leader in green transport technologies by 2030. The £2.9 billion into defence also signals a commitment to maintaining the UK's role on the global stage. Part of the funds earmarked for modernising military tech and cybersecurity systems. And speaking of systems, everyone's favourite system is getting modernised. HMRC. Yay! No mention of more regular reporting for the self-employed, at least yet anyway, but they are aiming to make it more efficient and clamp down on umbrella companies who exploit workers. And they also want to increase the interest rate on unpaid tax, so people will pay it sooner. They also want to go after promoters of tax avoidance schemes, which should be a good thing. Coupled with the fact they've confirmed they're ending the non-dom status, which we all expected, to make sure people who make money in the UK pay tax in the UK, which is a good move for raising tax. It's actually pretty crazy how people have been able to avoid it for so long, while people who can't afford it just pay the full rate. A couple of other things that were expected: they confirmed that VAT will be added to private schools, as well as ending some of their business relief that they get. They've increased the levy on energy companies, raising windfall tax to 38%. I mean, bear in mind it was already 35%, so it's nothing groundbreaking. They've also pledged more support to Ukraine, $2.26 billion in support, paid for by interest on frozen Russian assets, which I think is quite clever. They're also increasing second home stamp duty from 2% to 5%, which may free up more of the housing market. They, however, didn't say much about the stamp duty that will be reverted back next year. The price at which stamp duty starts to be charged will revert back for first-time buyers to £300,000 from £400,000 $425,000. For all other buyers, it will be reduced to $125,000 from the current level of $250,000. We've also had a few smaller taxes. One aimed particularly at the wealthy was on air passenger tax. For a standard economy flight, it's an increase of £2 per flight. Private passengers will be increased by 50%, which will cost them roughly £450 per passenger. There's a tax coming to vaping to put people off, and perhaps the most welcome tax, which had everybody cheering, was a reduction on draft beer by 1.7%. There were some more minor changes to alcohol, but I won't bore you with the details. So they were the main ones, but let's talk more specific and talk about the ones you really want to know about, the ones that will directly impact your investments. First was to do with capital gains tax, which we knew was going to be a big one in this budget. The lower rate is going to be increased from 10% to 18%, and the higher rate from 20% to 24%. Investors will feel this change, especially those relying on gains from long-term investments like property or equities. Even though these rates are still lower than other G7 countries, the hikes are intended to bring in an extra $2.5 billion annually for the Treasury. This means you can now pay more capital gains tax on assets, including shares. However, you've still got your £3,000 allowance, which you can take advantage of each year. If you're building up a big gain, you might be able to gradually take it over a period of years, so you won't pay capital gains tax as long as you stay within your £3,000 limit each year. One way you can cope with a higher bill is to use losses. When you complete your tax return, you can add details of losses you've made, which will be offset against your gains when you're calculating how much capital gains tax that you owe. If you make more losses than gains, you should still make an extra claim for extra losses, and then you can carry them forward into the next tax year. If you're married or in a civil partnership, you can also transfer the ownership of some of your investments to your spouse or civil partner. There's no capital gains tax to pay on the transfer. When they sell up, there might be tax to pay, but they have their own capital gains allowance that they can take advantage of. And also, if you have an ISA allowance available, you can use the BED and ISA process. Then when your investments are within an ISA, you won't have to worry about UK dividend tax or CGT. They've also increased the carried interest on capital gains to 32%, which won't affect most people. The other big one on the chopping block was inheritance tax. About 6% of estates are expected to pay this tax each year. The threshold is frozen until 2030, but with a twist. Pensions are now being counted as part of the estate, increasing the likelihood of paying inheritance tax, so that 6% number could increase quite quickly. This could potentially impact thousands of more estates, especially those who have substantial pensions saved up for retirement. In fact, the Treasury expects an additional $2 billion from this change alone. At present, a lump sum can be paid to an individual's beneficiaries tax-free, up to £1,073,100. This is different from how the payment is usually made of a dependent's pension, which is usually taxed as income. One report said that pensions were never intended as vehicles for inheritance tax planning, so overall this could make sense, and is a more attractive solution for raising revenue than many of the speculated alternatives such as reforming pension tax relief or imposing national insurance on employers' pension contributions. Again, this one's a touchy subject, as the vast majority of us feel like we shouldn't be paying any at all, but on our hard-earned money that we've already paid tax on. Maybe more incentive to spend and enjoy it while you can. There was also a change to AIM-listed stocks. AIM-listed stocks are shares of companies that trade on the Alternative Investment Market, AIM, which is a sub-market of the London Stock Exchange designed for smaller, growing businesses. The UK stocks listed on this market will have a 20% inheritance tax applied to them, as part of a range of inheritance tax measures aiming to raise up to $2 billion. The measures, which will still see a 50% relief applied to these AIM-listed stocks, has provided UK small-cap investors with some relief, following rumours that any tax relief would be completely abolished. In response, the AIM market has ticked up immediately after the announcement from the Chancellor. Now let's talk about what we're all itching to know about, the ISA changes. Chancellor Hargreaves didn't make any direct changes to individual savings accounts, keeping the limits fixed while confirming that the British ISA would be scrapped. The annual ISA allowance has constantly been upped in recent years, starting at £7,000 in 1999, then to £7,200 in 2008, it went to £10,200, £15,000, and then finally to £20,000 in 2017. In the budget today, the government said that the annual subscription limit will remain at £20,000 for ISAs, £4,000 for lifetime ISAs, and £9,000 for junior ISAs and child trust funds until April 2030, which is a pretty big commitment. Labour also confirmed their decision to scrap the British ISA, which had been announced by Chancellor Jeremy Hunt in the spring budget in March. The specialist stocks and shares ISA would have allowed savers to invest an extra £5,000 tax-free into UK equities on top of the £20,000 ISA allowance. The policy received mixed reactions. The chief of AJ Bell called it a political gimmick, and head of money at Hargreaves Lansdown said it's a relief to see this ISA scrap. Really, the British ISA would have just added more complexity to what is already for most people a pretty complicated system in picking the right type of investment account. I thought it was a pretty bad idea that would just make it complicated for everybody. So thankfully, we've had no reduction in the limits, no ISA caps, and no reduced pension tax reliefs. Now we can all breathe a sigh of relief. One good piece of news did come in the way of fractional shares. We've had some clarity that they will still remain ISA compliant, which is an integral part of ETF investing and investing more broadly. So this is a welcome confirmation that will remain. So, what's the verdict from this budget? On the positive side, the increase in the national minimum wage, business rates relief, and more NHS funding are all meant to help the working class and healthcare services. The windfall levy was made such a big thing about, and they've only increased it 2%, which I think is a bit strange, considering they were so adamant about it and how Conservatives loved the energy companies so much, claimed they needed to be penalised and there was nothing there, and they've only raised it 2%. Seems a bit strange to me, but economists have said this could add just by 2% an additional $5 billion in revenue over the next year, which could be crucial for funding other investments. However, it's not all rosy. Inheritance tax changes and the rise in employers' national insurance are likely to hurt small businesses and middle-income earners the most. Critics argue including inherited pensions in the inheritance tax calculation is a significant departure from the government's previous stance. The IFS has raised concerns that this could discourage pension saving, which contradicts the long-term goals of encouraging financial security in retirement. Many of these measures feel like a balancing act, trying to plug holes in public finances while not upsetting too many people at once. Whether or not Reeves can successfully walk that tightrope remains to be seen. This budget is full of big promises and even bigger numbers. From tax hikes on employers to increases in inheritance taxes, Reeves is clearly trying to restore stability. But it does come at a cost. She's already been hit at for the sheer amount she's borrowing to do so. It's the second biggest tax rising budget that we've seen. Spending and tax have remained about the same, but it's the borrowing which is much higher than expected. In fact, it's an extra $40 billion more than what was talked about in March this year. Although I think Rishi came out firing, and if you take out all of the name calling and finger pointing, I think generally the changes weren't that bad. They could have been so much worse. Hopefully these taxes will hit some people in the right places and not the wrong ones. There's definitely some cons, but let's be honest, there could have been a lot more cons. Only time will really tell. We'll see what will happen. I remember listening to past budgets and thinking they sounded pretty positive too for the most part, but let's see. I just hate how they over-exaggerate everything so much on both sides and come up with these crazy claims. It really puts me off the whole thing and makes it seem way more immature and cheaper than it should be. But hey ho, that's politics I suppose. At least for now we can stick to our plans for the most part and keep building our investment portfolios without worrying too much. I hope this coverage was helpful. If it was, here's some more videos that you might find helpful. And if you haven't already seen it, I'd really encourage you to watch this video, as you could end up thousands better off by getting it right. Thanks.